Okay, so thank you everyone for joining us today. If you would like to turn on your cameras, feel free to do so. I'm sure Bruce would love to see all your handsome and pretty faces. And so Bruce is actually the founder of Edwards Mediation Academy. Edwards Mediation Academy is actually one of our platinum sponsors. They will be sponsoring a free course to all the gold recipients for in the mediation advocate category, as well as in the mediator category. So without further ado, I'm just going to hand over the time to Bruce now.
Thank you, Jessica. I appreciate the opportunity to talk with you. Thank you so much for spending time tonight and staying up late to listen to me. I look forward to getting to know each of you a bit better in the days or weeks ahead. As Jessica has said, along with my wife, Susan Edwards, I'm a co-founder of the Edwards Mediation Academy. I'll talk about my background in just a moment, but first I would like to thank Jessica and the rest of our hosts at CME, as well as all of you for including us in this collaborative event coming up in the ensuing weeks. We're excited about your mediation competition and hearing about how it all goes, if not observing some of it firsthand. Also, congratulations on your career path. It's just so heartening for us to see people who are committed to the mediation process at such an early stage of their careers. We'll talk more about that in the ensuing 45 minutes or so. But along the way, our hope here at Edwards Mediation Academy is to help you broaden your skills, certainly to improve your sort of professional stature coming out of law school, moving into a mediation career. I'll give you the one of the secrets of this mediation profession, which I usually save for much later in the process after I've met people. But it is impossible to become a better mediator or a better mediation advocate without also becoming a better human being. So the lessons that we hope to be discussing both in our course and beyond are lessons that will serve you well, not just in your professional life, but in your personal lives. I'm going to talk a bit. I know it's a little late for many of you. Do feel free to include questions through the chat function, and Jessica will help at an appropriate time for me to try and address those questions. And for those of you who are comfortable asking those questions live, you're welcome to do that when we get to that point as well. I'd like to start with a little bit of my background, because as you, the process tonight is to better understand who we are at Edwards Mediation Academy and how we can help you. The narrow question is, which of the two courses that will be provided many of you, be they the Mediation Skills course or the Mediation Advocacy course, will be best for you as a starting point, into this profession. But the broader question, of course, is what does the mediation profession offer you? And what can we at Edwards Mediation Academy do to support your learning and your career trajectory? So I like to think and hope that this becomes really the foundation for a long relationship, not just one that extends through the mediation competition itself. To better understand who we are, I think it's important for me to just talk very briefly about my journey, not because it's self-lauding, but because it offers, I think, a suggestion of what's possible for each of you. And when I was, my background was in psychology as an undergraduate student, and I learned a lot about communication and human behavior, but I always wanted to be a lawyer. And I went to law school and I joined a big law firm in downtown San Francisco. And it was in litigation where I was being trained to resolve disputes, how most American lawyers are trained to resolve disputes, by doing battle in the litigation environment, using codes of civil procedure and rules of evidence and other ways to formalize dispute resolution. But along the way, I realized pretty quickly that it was less than satisfactory, not just for me, but more importantly for my clients. And I started comparing what I was being taught to do versus what I had learned in my psychology classes about how humans interacted with each other, how they dealt with conflict, with emotions, and other aspects of normal sort of human interaction. And after about 5 years into my legal practice, I started exploring this process of bringing people together and talking informally about dispute resolution. And ultimately decided after about 9 years of being a lawyer that I was going to go out and see if there was a commercial venture possible in the world of mediation. And there was nothing about mediation in those days. People didn't know the word. Nobody in the legal community understood it. Courts had a complete ignorance of the process. And so in 1989, over about 30 years ago, I left the practice of law and with a partner went into a 1,000-square-foot office and started to try and commercialize this process of dispute resolution to tried and true litigators who I had worked with over the ensuing 9 years in San Francisco and beyond. And that really was sort of the humble beginnings. I'm fond of telling people, I spoke to the Northern California Mediation Academy at their annual dinner last week. And I said, look, if I can do it, I was no name, no reputation, not a retired judge. I had nothing going for me other than my enthusiasm, no financial backing. And if I could leave the secure practice of law and take on this profession when there was no profession other than the one I was about to create, then there's hope for everybody. And as I travel around the world and I teach mediators, that's a big part of the lesson that I try and impart. After about 20 some years of mediating every day, now up to closer to 30, but somewhere midstream, I began teaching mediation. And I began teaching mediation, the advanced mediation course at the Strauss Institute for Dispute Resolution at Pepperdine University, which is the highest ranked dispute resolution program in the United States for those seeking an advanced degree. From there, teaching, as I've said, in about 20 different countries, from India to Brazil to Malaysia to the Republic of Georgia, Austria, Canada, I could go on, but had the pleasure in the last 15 or 20 years of teaching in numerous countries and find a lot of similarities in both the challenge of what we're teaching and the challenges that young mediators and attorneys find within their communities. So we'll talk more about that. But somewhere midstream in all of that teaching, I realized a couple things. I realized that many people in the world are not going to have the luxury of or the money, candidly, to travel to some of the places in the world, London, Harvard, Pepperdine, where they could undergo formal education. And yet they still needed the same skills, the same exposure to the last 30 years of lessons that we've learned here in the United States. And so the opportunity to put many of those lessons in a virtual online platform and leverage those lessons as far as the internet will take us was a compelling motivation for my wife and I to start the Edwards Mediation Academy. And frankly, the other aspect of my motivation was, for the last 30 years, I have been surrounded by some of the more talented people in the United States who, like me, have found their way into the profession at various stages and have carved out their own niche and their own expertise, and along the way developed their own learning and stories that are ripe for sharing. And I really wanted to capture those stories and those life lessons for the benefit of you and everybody else who might then later have the opportunity to look at an online training course. And so our courses are unique. Fortunately, and unlike tonight, you're not going to sit and listen to me talk for hours on end. What you're going to do is see courses that are an amalgamation of a mediation role play that we filmed over several days. You're going to see vignettes of these interviews with, depending on the course, we've interviewed over 30 professionals from around the world, leading mediators, neurobiologists, process design professionals, professors, and the like. And you'll see vignettes of their comments to support various moments of learning. And then, of course, there will be narrative. There'll be interactive exercises and self-reflection, which is a big part of what we believe in. We work closely with online development people who appreciate and coach us in the direction of making the learning interactive so that you've got the highest possible opportunity for retaining the knowledge and making it as deep as possible. And so to that extent, we like to believe our courses are unique in terms of what's out there on the internet. So tonight, really for you, the question in part is, an opportunity to get to know each other, ask questions, but also along the way to maybe get some kind of a sense of what is right for you between these two courses and going forward. The two courses that are being offered through the CME Collaborative Mediation Competition is the Mediation Skills course, designed for those most interested in becoming mediators, and the Mediation Advocacy course, which is designed primarily for those looking to expand their skills as attorneys and to develop winning results for their clients in the mediation process. And so it's really, I guess as a starting point for discussion, appreciate you can't go wrong in making that selection. Both of the courses have been prepared with the same thoughts in mind that I just outlined, the same exposure to a variety of experts weighing in. And really, it's a lot like if you're familiar with the parable of the 6 blind men examining an elephant and trying to describe the elephant. One stands at the tail and feels the tail and describes what the elephant must be like, and another stands at the other end stroking the trunk and trying to describe the elephant from the front. To some degree, that's what we're asking you to do with these courses, because the process of mediation is really the same. You're just looking at it through a different lens at the same moment in time. And so our course, one of the ways that it's structured to try, all of our courses really, to try and help you compartmentalize and decelerate the learning, is to break the course into modules, and so that you can sort of think about and talk about, develop a vocabulary for and strategies about the mediation process, thinking about it as it occurs over time. So I'm gonna give you a couple examples of those modules, and along the way, talk with you about how the Mediation Skills course and the Mediation Advocacy course might differ slightly in their approach. As one example, we talk a lot about the opening process itself. The concept, of course, being that mediation is a human intervention that involves bringing people together to the table at the same time. And while that's changed a bit for many of us in the last 8 months, given the COVID-19 environment around the world, I think for most of us, we will return to a day where there's a right balance between virtual mediation and in-person mediation. In fact, I'm writing a blog about that very topic as we speak. But back to the opening session. As a mediator, the goal for an opening session is to create an environment of safety and hope for all of the participants. And how one goes about that really is sort of the key to success in many respects. And so the course on mediation skills talks about how you prepare for and how you behave as the mediator in that opening session, how you communicate with the parties, how you allow them to move forward in an organized fashion, but an authentic fashion, and goes into great details about how to make that part of the process a successful foundation for everything that will follow. And at the same time, you hypothetically are sitting at the head of the table, sort of directing traffic, if you will, in that challenging moment. The Mediation Advocacy course just looks at that moment from a different lens. As a mediation advocate, the question is, what should you be doing in preparation with your client and in that moment to try and achieve the best possible outcome and to build the best possible foundation for everything that will follow over the course of that process. And so you're simply looking at the details of success from 2 different vantage points of the same table at the same moment. I'll give you another module and another example. We do spend a lot of time in our courses on communication skills, because communication is the stock in trade that we all have, whether we're mediators or we're mediation advocates. How do we communicate our positions and other people's positions in ways that people can listen and understand? And so along the way, we talk a lot about listening skills. We talk a lot about different types of questions to broaden your understanding about both. And so it doesn't matter whether you are the mediator learning how to better communicate, or you're the mediation advocate learning how to better communicate. Communication skills transcend those roles. And the lessons that we teach around listening and around questions and around other aspects of nonverbal communication are germane to both lawyers and mediators. So that's another example. We talk a lot about emotions in our courses, and without sort of divulging too much or going too far afield, one of the key reasons that drove me into the field of mediation over 30 years ago was a recognition that, at least in the United States, our traditional legal system did a very poor job of trying to address human emotions. And in fact, one of the sort of, I think, failings of dispute resolution worldwide was a formalization of legal processes over the years that really focused exclusively on facts and law and left emotion out of the dispute resolution conversation. And we know, although I surmised it 30 years ago, we know now much more clearly from neurobiological research, magnetic resonance imaging, and study of the human brain, that emotion plays a direct role in conflict, that in fact, emotions cannot be separated from cognitive thinking. And so it's a fallacy to try and separate the two. And so in the mediation process, what we try and do is bring together a conversation about authentic emotions and cognitive thoughts as we address them, both from the mediator's perspective and in the course on mediation advocacy, from understanding your client's emotional needs and interests. And so how we deal collectively with those emotions in this process, again, a vantage point from two different directions, but the same topic of conversation. And the last example in the sort of communication piece is much more of the recent conversation about what we've learned about implicit bias and how bias impacts our conversations around diversity and equity and inclusion and how that fits in the dispute resolution process. Many of the disputes that you will encounter cross cultural lines, cross racial lines, may cross political lines, and all the more important to better understand how we process information, how we perceive individuals, and particularly how our brains work in a way that creates biases for ourselves and impacts how we view and communicate with others. And again, doesn't matter if you're the mediator, better understanding that concept and tailoring your skills to be able to address those challenges, or the attorney in the room doing the same. Those are important lessons for both. So these are a variety of examples of how we approach the mediation process in the courses from slightly different perspectives, but with overlapping substance, because obviously the substance of the process remains the same. The issue that maybe confronts you in a slightly broader sense, not tonight, of course, because hopefully you won't have these decisions to make too quickly, but as you process through the upcoming competition, you complete your studies, you move into the mediation sphere in a broader sense, you're all going to be trying to decide what's the best fit for you. And hopefully, our hope is at Edwards Mediation Academy is that not only can we support your learning, but we can help support your career trajectory and your choices that line up with your skills. So I'm fond of telling people that as you contemplate where you're headed in the mediation profession, the task is pretty simple. You just need to find your skills, find your passion, and marry the two. Simple as that. Find your skills, find your passion, and marry the two. And so the first part of that, in terms of finding your skills, is to some degree an exercise in honest self-reflection. I counsel people all the time who want to go into mediation, talk to your closest friends, your family members, ask them difficult but honest questions to help your self-evaluative process. Am I a good listener? Do I talk too much? How do I come across? Am I empathetic? Have I been the kind of person that shows caring? Am I the kind of person that's a good debater? Do you see me in this role? What suggestions might you have if you were to envision me in this role that I could do to make myself better? I mean, all of those kinds of conversations with those who know you best are going to help you form an honest assessment and impression of what your skills are. And it's only a starting point, None of this is intended to say, gee, once you get your answer, it's time to hang up your cleats and go home. To the contrary, it's simply a foundation to give you an honest assessment of your starting point and what you need to spend time working on and developing before you move forward in the profession. And so then you need to sort of find your passion. You know, is your passion representing clients? You know, is your passion looking for solutions? You know, I've had people come out of 40-hour training programs and say all sorts of things to me. They'll say, gee, Bruce, I've completed your training and it was fabulous. I've learned so much about myself. I've learned so much about the mediation process. But fundamentally, I've learned that I can never do what you do. I either don't have the patience, I don't have the enthusiasm. I want to go back to representing clients, but I assure you I'm going to be a better client representative now, knowing what you've taught me. Or in contrast, I'll have other people who come at the end of the process of training and say, you know, I've kind of been doing this my whole life. You know, I look at my circle of friends, I look at my family, and I've always been the peacemaker between my siblings or between, you know, my father and my sister. And now I appreciate what you've done. You've given me a vocabulary, you've given me a context, and you've given me hope that there may even be a profession out there, you know, for me at some point in time. And so people will come out of these training courses with a lot of impressions about themselves and about their future role, which is fine. That's to be expected. But one of the things that I will try and encourage you is this. In the United States, again, when I started, there was no career path. Let me say that again, because for most of you, that's not the case. And certainly around the world, even in developing countries where we're talking about this, it's not the case. When I started 30 years ago, nobody knew what mediation was. And yet now, 30 years later, we have fairly well-defined career paths. We have people mediating in family law mediation exclusively. We have people who are volunteer community mediators who do this process as an adjunct to their other chosen professions. We have people like me who are everyday commercial mediators, mediating 8 to 10 hours a day of some of the larger multi-party complex cases. We have people who are mediation advocates. We have people who are court annexed mediators, you know, working for the court system on cases either before they go to trial or in the appellate court system after they've gone through a trial and are now on appeal. Last month, I had the privilege of speaking to the annual conference of the International Ombuds Association, where I spoke to people whose career path took them to an ombuds role for major universities or hospitals or high-tech companies or branches of government, not just in the United States, but in different countries. And so really the challenge for each of you is certainly to look at this array of career choices, but don't feel at all limited. In other words, I would hope that each of you would come out of all of these conversations, this competition, your graduate programs, and sort of ask yourself, you know, what is the best entry portal for me based on my skills and my passion? And if there's not a career path that's already there, make one of your own. Spend time thinking about how you can marry your passion and your skills in a direction that's right for you, whether or not it currently exists, or it's something that you have to weave out of whole cloth, just as I did 30 years ago. Because in that adventure, there's tremendous fulfillment, if not ultimately success. So those are some thoughts. I leave you, at least on this topic, with one of my favorite Nelson Mandela quotes, which is, "It always seems impossible until it's done." And so think about those words as you think about your own career path in the direction of mediation, whether that takes you as a mediator, it takes you as a mediation advocate, or it takes you in a different direction, you know, entirely. I think, Jessica, what I should do, I've been talking for some time. I appreciate everybody's attention, but I do want to make this interactive and respond to people's questions the best I can. Have any questions come in that you would like to direct to me?
Well, we do have one question from Nao Shin. So Naushin's asking, which institution do you teach in India?
So my teaching in India has been somewhat varied. Let me share with you a little background that all sort of came together in India. My day job is mediating through a company called JAMS. And JAMS is the largest provider of alternative dispute resolution commercial services in the United States. We mediate over 16,000 cases a year. We're a $200 million US enterprise and have shown many around the world what can be done in the field of commercial dispute resolution. As an adjunct to that company, one of my partners, Danny Weinstein, a retired judge, has established an international fellowship program where we've had, for the last 10 or 11 years, we've had mediators and those looking to be in the dispute resolution profession apply from around the world. And every year we select about 10 or 12 individuals. They're not all commercial mediators. Some are retired judges, some are mediators, some are professors studying mediation. We have people who mediate in refugee camps in South Sudan. So a broad spectrum of people come to us and we train them. And they then go home to their home countries and use the lessons that they have learned in 2 to 6 months of witnessing, shadowing mediations, going through educational processes and the like in the United States. They take those lessons, they put them through a filter of culture and language and what's right for them, and they apply those skills in their own countries. And so we've had people from Singapore. We've certainly had people from now, I think we're up to 76 countries that are represented by over 130 of our alumni who have gone through this problem, including about, I think 4 or 5 students from India. And one of those students is Laila Olapalli, and Laila is from Bangalore. And she and her daughter, Tara Olapalli, have established the Center for Advanced Mediation Practice called CAMP. It's in Bangalore. And so that is one of the entry points for our training in India, has been working with CAMP, establishing a relationship. I've traveled there several times, taught 40-hour courses to lawyers and judges in Bangalore. I've also, another entry point is the current director of the Strauss Institute for Dispute Resolution in Pepperdine is Dr. Sukhsimran Singh, who is of Indian descent. And he and I have traveled to Delhi at the invitation of the India Supreme Court to teach advanced mediation skills to judges as they look to implement the law in India. And I'm told that, just sort of parenthetically, they've now developed a law which is going to require mediation training in all of their law schools in India. In addition to working in those 2 venues, we now have contacts with general counsel of Indian corporations that we're going to be working with, probably in Mumbai. And we have other JAMS international fellows, as we call our alumni, working in different parts of the country where once it's fair game to travel again, we'll be back doing teaching. So a long-winded answer, but to give you a sense of our different approaches to helping develop and implement mediation in India per se.
Thank you, Bruce. We have another question from Lily. So Lily's question is, what's the difference between mediation in United States as compared to mediation conducted in other territories or other countries?
It's a great question. It depends on the other country, of course, and it depends on what type of mediation you're talking about. So it's sort of a 3-dimensional answer to the question. If you think about it in 2 dimensions, development of mediation is a continuum. Think about it as a line or a linear continuum from no mediation whatsoever to, at least in the United States, what is a fairly advanced mediation paradigm somewhere far along that line. And then what makes the line three-dimensional, of course, is whether you're talking about commercial mediation, family mediation, community mediation, court-annexed mediation, et cetera. And all of those lines might be slightly different, again, depending on the country you're talking about. But in a very general, broad brush answer to the question, I would say that most countries around the world are still in the nascent or beginning stages of developing mediation within their country. Singapore, of course, being an example of a somewhat advanced, I think, culture of mediation to this point, if you can use that as a comparison with what we find in other countries. I'll give you an example. One of the big projects we worked on in the last 4 or 5 years is in Rwanda, again, working with some of our international fellows. We've gone there now 4 times. We've probably trained about 20% of their bar association in mediation skills, and during our most recent visit in January on mediation advocacy skills. We've probably trained an even larger portion of their judiciary, starting with registrars, but all the way up to the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court and the Minister of Justice. We've worked with our fellows to help implement a policy of mediation to be adopted by their legislature so that it can then expand through the Minister of Justice into all branches of society in Rwanda. And they're just developing a mediation society of mediators as we speak. So we've really spent a lot of time developing a strong foundation for what we hope will soon take off as sort of mandatory mediation within their legal system. But where on the continuum is that? You know, that's probably only about 10 or 15% along the path as I describe that country. And I could go through a similar exercise with Brazil or the Republic of Georgia or Turkey or other places. Different places occupy different points along that spectrum. But that gives you an idea. What we try and do when we go into these countries is not just focus exclusively on implementing mediation in the civil justice system, although that's a very convenient toehold for us to get conversations with prime ministers, ministers of justice, justices of Supreme Courts and lawyers. But from there, we try and leverage that opportunity to speak with others, and going so far as to, with certain countries, I won't name names at the moment to keep them confidential, but to develop what we call a 3-year roadmap for implementing mediation within their entire country, from implementing mediation in their school systems to implementing mediation training for lawyers and judges, of course, but ultimately to implement mediation in other aspects of their government, their communities, their cultural issues and the like. And so those are some of the thoughts that underlie our broad approach to mediation and mediation training. But hopefully that answers your question a little bit about sort of the culture of mediation development around the world.
Great. So we have a question again, and I'm going to apologize in advance if I mispronounce your name. It's a question from Kandula. So what is the nature of mediation in criminal matters in America? Do you think it's possible?
Another very interesting question. I do think it's possible. When we started mediation 30 years ago, obviously myself and my initial partner were both civil attorneys and civil litigators. Neither of us had direct experience in the criminal justice system. And so our focus at the time was, yes, developing a broad mediation community, but at the same time, obviously, we needed economic success to be sustainable. So we focused on what we describe as kind of the low-hanging fruit, those parties in civil litigation who would be most accepting of a mediation process and willing to pay for it. Along the way, we did have discussions about whether there was an entry portal for mediation in the criminal justice system in the United States. We really haven't pursued that with a lot of vigor. We've talked to criminal lawyers. And what's interesting is, at least in the United States, I'm not as familiar with the Singapore, criminal procedures, criminal justice system, of course, as much as I am maybe with Rwanda or some other countries. But in some countries, some cultures, there obviously is plea bargaining, where there's opportunity for negotiation. And to that extent, certainly a big module in our mediation courses is negotiation skill, which would be equally appropriate in a civil context as it may be in a criminal context for some. In Rwanda this last February, earlier this year, we experimented with our first training program for criminal prosecutors, where we attempted to adapt the mediation training to the criminal justice field, and particularly to talk about whether in the setting of plea bargaining or victim offender restitution conversations, there was a place for mediation training. And it was well received. It was eye-opening for some. It was a new venture for us. So I'd say at this point, just as mediation can find its way beyond the civil justice system into politics, broader society, there's no reason that it can't be adapted in some respects to criminal justice system, taking the best of our learning and certainly applying it through a filter of what that system looks like.
Well, I definitely do agree with you, Bruce, because I mean, mediation is all about social and human interactions, you know. So the thing is that oftentimes we forget that even criminal law also contains human interactions. And I personally feel that mediation is very much applicable in terms of like criminal matters, as well as for like restorative justice.
Jessica, I couldn't have said it better.
So we have a question next from Brian. So I think Brian's question is actually applicable everywhere and not just in the UK. So for new mediators, especially those without a strong track record in what is perceived as a parallel career such as law, often find it difficult to get work, make a living, as well as break into higher level of disputes. You mentioned that you came into the field not as a beginning. So what's one piece of advice would you give to participants who are in a similar position?
It's a great question, and certainly one that's posed to me quite often by young mediators in different parts of the world. At some point, everybody has to start, and the question is, how do you start? While it's not the topic for tonight's conversation, one of our careers that we developed, one of our courses we developed, it was in response to this question because it is such a frequent question. We have a 30-hour course in our Mediation Academy on developing your career and your culture of mediation. I think probably one of the short answers, so I can't do it justice in a 2-minute answer, of course, but what I can say is, again, starting with self-reflection, sort of find out what your career trajectory is going to be, and then do two things: both plan, meaning develop a business plan, because so many come into this profession thinking that all they need to do is call a few friends and let people know they're going to get started as a mediator, and the phone is going to ring and the internet's going to start clicking and they're going to be off and running. It's a lot of hard work, particularly in the early stages. So you need a plan. And part of that plan is to be realistic in your entry point. And by that, I mean both substantively and geographically target a small enough audience and a small enough swath of potential disputes that you can be laser-like focused in your approach to getting those first cases. You don't have to be everything to everybody. And certainly trying to be everything to everybody at the outset is a recipe for failure, because your diffuse efforts are going to not allow you to land, cases. And I'm speaking now, obviously, in a commercial context, because those of you that choose to be a court-annexed mediator, you might be hired by the court. If you're choosing to be an ombuds, you'll be hired by a corporation. You're choosing to be a community mediator, it may be volunteer, and the cases may be referred from the community mediation center in your community. But in the commercial world, which is how I'm defining this question, you need a business plan and you need a narrow focus, both in terms of what area you're trying to practice geographically and what substantive area you want to target first. Doesn't mean you're going to be limited to that. It just means initially your resources and your focus is going to be in that direction, so you can have the best chance of early success. And then I describe it as building the wall one brick at a time. I remember my early mindset still to this day, and sitting in that 1,000-square-foot office, wondering if I'd made the right decision leaving the safety of my law job. And I remember my initial business plan, I only need to mediate 2 cases each month to make the payment on this rent and to otherwise be able to move forward in this career. So that's 24 cases. Who are the people that I'm going to need to contact and be in touch with to try and identify 24 cases? And assume I do a good job with some of those early mediations, some of those people might repeat and make that task even easier. And so it was that kind of mindset and focused thinking that allowed me to really, I think, get out of the starting blocks and run down the track.
Okay, thank you, Bruce. I'm just going to move down a little bit because Raka's question is sort of like a part 2 to Brian's questions. So what are your suggestions for recent law graduates wishing to pursue a career in international mediation?
That is an intriguing question, and I don't get asked that particularly often. There are, again, I want to give you a quick story, and then I will answer the question. I've shared with you the story of our Weinstein International Fellows, people who come and train with us in the United States and go back to their countries. About 2 years ago, we established a nonprofit called the Weinstein International Foundation, which is set up to help support many of these people once they go back into their home countries. And on our board, we have not just myself and my colleague, Danny Weinstein, who founded the nonprofit. We have a former US ambassador to Southeast Asia. We have Sukhsimran Singh, as I've said earlier, who runs the Pepperdine program, and a host of very experienced mediators and people whose thoughts are, how do we try and help all of these fellows, many of whom are looking to mediate cross-border disputes, whether it's water rights, fishing rights, political conflict, cultural conflict. As one example, we just had a conversation 2 weeks ago with some of our fellows in Armenia and Azerbaijan, talking with them about things that they might do to be involved in their sort of international cross-cultural conflicts. The question is sort of how does one get involved in those, and particularly when a lot of the interventions seem to be under the auspices of political offices, and so it's hard to sort of find that moment. I don't have a pithy, quick, easy answer, other than I do think it sort of takes the same kind of focus I was just describing toward a career in commercial mediation, but to develop it in the direction of international, relations. And whether you're continuing your formal education in international relations and then moving in the direction of some government offices where you can use mediation skills under the auspices of a government authority to be engaged in international dispute resolution, or you're looking for some more private intervention. Much of the private intervention that I'm aware of at the moment, I would say kind of falls under the umbrella of peacekeeping, right? And many nonprofits out there are involved in peacekeeping kinds of issues, whether it's nuclear disarmament or things that will promote women's rights to education in the Middle East or Africa, or different ways that you can make a difference in an international setting. And so lots of examples, lots of ideas, but they take sort of laying the right foundation for yourself educationally, credentialing, and then developing the plan, as I go back to and say, it's the one that marries your passion with your skills. And if that's in an international forum, God bless you, because we need all the help in that direction we can get.
Thanks, Bruce. So next we have a question from Desmond. So it's quite commonplace for most mediators to actually have a legal background before they join the mediation industry. So do you think it is necessary or recommended to have a law degree as a mediator?
I want to be careful how I answer this because I don't want to offend anyone. But the skill set of mediation and dispute resolution is a broad skill set, and it should not be the monopoly of the legal profession, be they retired judges or retired lawyers. That doesn't mean that there is not a role, an appropriate role for lawyers and judges. There clearly is, as witnessed by my company. 80% of my partners are retired judges. 20% roughly are former attorneys like myself, and a few others have diverse backgrounds beyond the law, but not many. So I don't think, to answer the question, it's necessary to have a legal background to develop the skills to be an effective mediator. Where I do think it is helpful and perhaps a leg up in a commercial context is, speaking of implicit bias, we have an implicit bias to work with people and interact with people who are from our own in-group, however we define that in-group. And if we define the in-group for purposes of this question as lawyers, judges, those from a legal background, it's easier to work with mediators who have that background. They speak the same language. You might be able to reference a code of procedure or a case or a court decision that resonates immediately, whereas you might have to explain that to someone who doesn't have a legal background. So unfortunately, and I use that word lightly, I say, unfortunately, having a legal background is a leg up in developing a commercial mediation practice. And candidly, there are still some countries, Turkey being one, that is mandating that mediators have a legal background. I think that's still a true statement. So that is the direction that the commercial mediation field has evolved from in many countries. But here's the big caveat. I think it is incumbent on all of us, even those particularly with a legal background, to throw open the door of this profession to the broadest possible audience. The needs for these kinds of skills of dispute resolution within our communities are too pervasive, are too essential for our sort of survival as communities, as political systems, just as human beings, to say, gee, we have to wait for a lawyer to be ready, before we can tackle this problem. There are psychologists, there are people, religious leaders, there are politicians who take my course at Pepperdine, people who come from a variety of backgrounds and take home these lessons to use in their chosen field in ways that I'm sure add value within their communities as much as we add value in a commercial context.
Great. Thanks for that. Well, I have met a couple of people as well, and there are a couple of mediators sitting on Simi's panel who don't actually have a legal background. So some of these are actually doctors, like the ones you see when you get sick, general practitioners, physicians. We also have some people in the construction field as well. I mean, it's small, but the field is getting larger to include those who don't have a legal background.
Jessica, thank you for triggering my memory as well. So I mediate a lot of large construction cases, and you're absolutely right that there are dispute resolution professionals who have engineering backgrounds, who have design backgrounds, who have actual construction backgrounds, who may participate in a dispute resolution board or design review board or other kinds of dispute resolution forums, and some who then work as mediators ultimately in those construction settings. To your point about doctors, I'll give you one example, hopefully that expands your thinking about what's possible. About 6 or 7 years ago now, we did a training experiment at Stanford University Hospital. And one of my good close friends happened to be the head of physicians, several thousand physicians in that facility. And we orchestrated a training, not for their lawyers, not for their risk department, but for the heads of the physicians, for the heads of nursing, for everybody in the C-suite, from the chief executive officer to the chief operating officer, et cetera. And we trained those people in 3-day modules over the course of a couple of years. And at the end of the program that involved the chief executive officer, he said, Bruce, what we really need is we need to have an emergency crash cart within the hospital that responds to disputes, just like we have a crash cart that responds to cardiac arrest and healthcare emergencies, because these lessons are too valuable not to just bring to the forefront of our professional lives. And so that was one example of how we took this training and these skills to develop mediation competency within that particular work environment. And along the way, people appreciated not just how it made them better in their work environment, but made them better in their personal lives. So as we talk about entry portals for careers as another example of broad thinking.
Great. So I hope that answers your question, Desmond. And we're coming up on the hour, so we're just going to answer a maximum of 2 to 3 more questions, and then we'll end the session. So I have a question from Mesty next. So Bruce, with regards to a mediation competition, what do you think is the difference between mediating in the competition and real life mediation?
I'll tell you this, because in preparation for our mediation courses, as I've mentioned, I've mediated several days of role play mediations. And I can tell you this, those were some of the hardest days that I have spent in what people might describe as a simulated mediation or dispute. And the practitioners, the attorneys in those cases were coached to be as hard on me as you could expect anybody to be in real life mediation. And we know from neurobiological testing that your participation in a simulated event strikes the same synapses, strengthens the same neuroprogramming that does real life experience. So the more you treat this process, this competition, as a real event, the more quickly you treat it as an authentic moment, the quicker your brain will deal with it as such, and the deeper your learning. And I promise that very quickly, you will be so deep in this competition, and the learning will be as real as it would be if you were in a different environment, and one that you might otherwise describe as a real event. In other words, there's very little distinction as far as your brain can discern between the competition and what might ultimately be a more professional event.
That sounds amazing, Bruce. So Mestin, I hope that answers your question. So we do have time for 1 or 2 more questions. If anyone would like to ask them, you can unmute yourself or actually place them in the chat. We have a question from Ashani. Mm-hmm. In real life, can a mediator have a co-mediator who is experienced or knowledgeable in the area of dispute? So for instance, if it's an IP-related matter, would it help if they have a co-mediator who is actually experienced or in that field?
Another great question. The whole concept of co-mediation is a portion of some of our courses, and it's a more involved conversation. The shorter answer is absolutely. There is a role for co-mediation, and depending on how you structure your commercial practice, the opportunity for inviting people in as co-mediators who have more substantive knowledge of a dispute, be it intellectual property or environmental law or construction processes or other substantive areas where as mediators we can't be sort of substantive experts across all trades and across all legal issues. Obviously, we want to develop our mediation process skills as best we can. And again, one of the secrets of the mediation profession is if you develop your mediation process skills to the highest possible level, it will serve you well and perhaps accommodate you even in the most foreign kind of substantive settings. But that said, there will still be opportunities where either the participants or you will conclude, gee, it would sure be helpful to have someone who knew a bit more about this subject matter than I do. And in that case, your choices are to educate yourself further or bring in somebody who can round out that knowledge. And when you choose the latter and you're working with a co-mediator, then the next question becomes, how do you co-mediate? And again, that's almost a different conversation, but one that does start with making sure that the two of you are on the same page in terms of how you're approaching that mediation, that you know how you're going to approach the parties, that you avoid some of the common traps that are out there in a co-mediation environment where mediators are pushed to align with different sides and without going into too much more detail, just different ways to approach the dispute and the process itself to give you the best chance of success. So absolutely, there's a keen role for substantive experts and substantive co-mediators in this process.
Well, definitely there's value in terms of co-mediation. And it's just that there seems to be a downside, especially if your co-mediator has sort of like a different mediation style from you, right? So this brings me to my next question, Bruce. What are your thoughts on the different mediation styles? Is there one that you prefer over any other?
Well, to the extent you would characterize it as a style, the courses go into lots of detail about the mediator's mind and your mental approach to the mediation process. And I'm not going to try and summarize it here because I would do an injustice to that description, other than to say a thoughtful listening approach that brings a measure of focused attention, empathy, critical listening, curiosity, and respect to the parties throughout the process is the best approach. That said, there's room for as many personalities to apply those skills as there are faces on this screen. And we all bring to the mediation environment our own communication style, whether we use humor, whether we use storytelling, or how we deliver messages. We're all different, obviously. And the goal is to, through self-reflection, identify our differences, build on them, and then apply the best of what we bring to the table in the dispute resolution moment, staying true to the kinds of lessons that are embedded in these courses, and that will set you on the right course.
Great. Thank you, Bruce. So that's about the last question that we have. And thank you everyone for joining us live today. And I'm sure Bruce enjoyed your company as well as you enjoyed his. Well, for those of you who would like to see more of Bruce and his wife, Susan, is actually going to be back next week with a networking event for all participants and attendees. I'm not sure what they're going to do yet, but I think Susan has said that she would like to play some games with all of you.
Can I leave people with one thought, Jessica? Because I too wanted to thank people for all of your time. I appreciate the late hour for you. And I do hope this is the beginning of a dialogue, and if not ultimately a relationship, where we can help support you in whatever fashion, regardless of whether you take a course. Our website, edwardsmediationacademy.com, updates people routinely on events and trends within the industry. And it's incumbent on all of us to be part of this developing community and to learn from each other. But as you contemplate your career path and your next steps, I'm going to end today with a quote because I grew up in Silicon Valley long before there was a Silicon Valley. And when I was sort of a high school student trying to figure out if I was going to head to law school, Steve Jobs was just down the road with Steve Wozniak playing in a garage, you know, tinkering with different computer parts and trying to develop this company. And so I'm fond of Steve Jobs quotes. And one of the things that he said is sort of a final litmus test for, you know, where your thought process is about next steps. But Steve, when he was alive, said, "Your work is going to fill a large part of your life. And the only way to be truly satisfied is to do what you believe to be great work. And the only way to do great work is to love what you do. If you haven't found it yet, keep looking. Don't settle. As with all matters to the heart, you will know it when you see it." So good luck in the upcoming competition. Above all else, enjoy the experience. We look forward to sharing that experience with you along the way. So thank you for your time tonight.
Thank you, Bruce.
Thank you, Jessica.
So that brings us to the end of the session, and we will see you soon for round 1 on Friday.